Good evening, both to those here and those joining online today. Thank you for inviting me. Firstly, my name is Seçil Özcan Geylani, and the research that I'm going to share with you today is part of my PhD dissertation, which was completed in 2023 in Middle East Technical University Department of History of Architecture PhD program. It was conducted under the supervision of my dear Professor Lale Özgenel. She is thankfully here with us today. The content that I'm going to share today is titled as Womanizing the Home, Domestic Modernity and Ambivalence in Mid-Century Turkey. As it is understood from here, I want to begin with the place we often overlook when we talk about modernity. It's the home. In mid-century Turkey, this everyday space became a site where new ideals were imagined, negotiated, and sometimes resisted, and most vividly through women's lives. I will present my content in five steps, as you can see here, that reflect the structure of my talk. I will begin with an introduction part, which will be focusing on the relationships between the home, modernity and narrative in mid-20th century Turkey, and I will continue with home as a stage of reform and change. I'll outline how post-war politics and American influence reshape domestic life in this geography. Then through womanizing the home, I will look at how women appeared as the main agents, subjects, and sometimes critics of this new domestic order. And from there, beyond the threshold, it will take us outside the apartment, tracing how women negotiated public space and visibility. And finally, in redefining dwelling, I will turn to the emotional and existential dimensions of home and how the mid-century house became a site not only of comfort, but also of constraint, ambivalence, and sometimes the desire to break away. So let me begin with the introduction part. With the Democrat Party's rise and its pro-American orientation after World War II, and American-style life increasingly penetrated the domestic sphere in Turkey, adding a new dimension to the discourse of modernity. This period saw intense cultural exposure to modernity through the home and homemaking, generating both scholarly and literary narratives, an intersection that frames the scope of my presentation. I approached the home in mid-century novels as a lived space, examining how domesticity was constructed through images of home and homemaking, and how different interpretations of modern emerged. While architectural literature largely treated housing as a technical and quantitative issue, literary texts reveal how these spaces were actually perceived and experienced. Thus, I use literary narratives to uncover overlaps and tensions between imagined, lived, and architecturally defined domestic spaces. The period from the 1930s to 70s is widely associated with socialist realist themes, and within this span, I focus on the mid-century when urbanization and individualization became more pronounced after 1950s. Architectural publications offer accounts of domestic experience, yet novels provide the perceptual dimensions often implicit in these texts. The selected novels, therefore, form a framework for rethinking the home as both a built and an effective space. This inquiry is guided by several questions, as we can see here. First, what new insights can literature provide about home and domesticity in mid-20th century Turkey? How do literary representations complicate or challenge the image of the home that architectural publications mostly define as a physical or technical matter? How did women navigate their evolving roles as homemakers, consumers, and modern subjects within this changing domestic landscape? And lastly, why did the mid-century home begin to lose its meaning as a stable refugee, and how did this affect the experiences of dwelling? Understanding these questions requires a brief look at the broader housing landscape, and post-war historiography emphasizes apartments, cooperatives, mass housing, and squatter settlements, and links the housing shortage to rapid rural to urban migration. After the 1948 slum amnesty, Turkish cities were increasingly shaped by apartment blocks and expanding squatter settlements. Turkish architectural publications of the time repeatedly highlighted unresolved housing issues, the need for low-cost housing, and the strain of unplanned urbanization. For instance, as early as 1954, architectural writers were already pointing out that construction costs were soaring, materials were pushed into the black market, and the housing crisis was unfolding despite a visible construction boom. And also by the mid-1960s, authors like Doğan Hasol were urging to state to redirect resources from scattered areas toward public housing, calling for planned interventions to curb and even demolish unhealthy squatter settlements. To see how these debates surface in cultural production, I reviewed 450 novels from this time span and selected 85 that most clearly depict domestic space and homemaking. To address these questions more precisely, the presentation now unfolds in three parts, as we can follow here. First, situating mid-century domesticity within the material and ideological shifts of the post-war era. Second, examining how architectural discourse conceptualized and visualized the modern home. And third, exploring how literature renders these spaces lived and problematized through narrative. This background sets the stage for understanding how modernity entered the home. The Second World War shaped the global mid-century, and even though Turkey did not take part in it, the country experienced similar post-war effects. In the late 1940s, the world divided in two superpowers whose competing ideologies defined the early Cold War, and Turkey, positioned between these blocs, became strategically important. With the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and the Marshall Plan soon after, the United States sought to contain Soviet influence and Turkey aligned itself closely with American policy. This alignment coincided with Turkey's own political transformation, the move to multi-party democracy in 1946 and the rise of the Democratic Party in 1950. These geographical shifts brought significant cultural changes. American advisors, capital, and institutions entered Turkey, and with them came new ways of living, especially within domestic spaces. Education agreements promoted American values, and everyday life increasingly absorbed American consumer habits. Domestic technology, new household services, and apartment living became the primary mediums through which this modern lifestyle was translated. While the earlier single-party era had emphasized austerity and economic strength, the Democrat Party encouraged open consumption. The term consumer durables entered common vocabulary, and refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios, and other electrical appliances became symbols of middle-class comfort and modernity, and in this way, the home emerged as a central site where American influence, technological change, and new domestic ideals visibly reshaped daily life in mid-century Turkey. In the post-war years, the US housing crisis brought domestic design into the spotlight, and magazines like House Beautiful promoted a warmer, more livable American style. This model blended modern technologies with familiar, comfortable forms and rejected the austerity of the international style. And even though Turkey's construction sector and architectural agenda differed significantly, similar ideals of good life modernism circulated through fairs, exhibitions, and popular magazines. These channels helped show how the modern home was imagined in mid-century Turkey. As a result, American-style decoration quickly became a visible marker of modernity for Turkey's growing middle and upper classes. Literature of the period echoes this cultural aspiration. Many novels describe interiors arranged in American taste and often featuring iconic elements like the American bar. These interiors did not simply signal wealth. They symbolized a desire to belong to an emerging, westernized and urban middle class, and particularly within the new apartment blocks transforming Turkish cities. For example, Refik Halit Karay describes American-style interiors in his novel Karlı Dağ'daki Ateş, The Fire on the Snow-Covered Mountain, as a new language of taste and class in apartment life by saying the living room they entered was immaculate, neat, and furnished with American taste. Selahattin Aydınalp presents the American Bard as another example, as a private refugee shaped by modern ideals in his novel Bir Şehrin Hayatı, The Life of a City, and says, on the opposite side of the hall to the entrance foyer was a very elegant little American bar. The furnishings were also satisfactory, cheap, but elegant. Kerime Nadir uses the American bar as a stage for cosmopolitan urban sociability in her novel Sisli Hatıralar, Misty Memories, and says, I headed for the American bar. Atıf was busy filling glasses at the American bar. Doreen and Dr. Shine were sitting opposite each other in a large armchair. Although the American bar appears frequently in literary narratives, it is far less visible in architectural publications of the same period. In Architect, it appears mostly in villa projects aimed at affluent clients, either as a built-in special feature or a piece of furniture. Architectural theorist Attila Yücel later noted that drinking at home did not become a regular domestic activity until the late 1970s, when it began to be grouped alongside cooking, eating, and leisure within residential action categories. While American-style decoration expressed the visual and cultural aspirations of mid-century domestic life, an equally powerful transformation unfolded through technology. To see how the modern home was reshaped not only aesthetically but also materially, my next section turns to the rise of domestic appliances and the emergence of the home as a technological hub. In the early Cold War years, post-war America witnessed a strong return to family life and domestic stability. The nuclear family, which is defined by a working husband and a full-time homemaker wife, was promoted as the ideal social model, and the home became a symbolic refuge in an anxious atomic age. Women's domestic labor gained new political meaning as the household was framed as essential to protecting national values. Events like the 1959 kitchen debate made this ideology highly visible, presenting modern appliances as proof of prosperity, freedom, and technological superiority. Yet the same discourse that celebrated women as capable homemakers also confined them to the domestic sphere, making the home both comforting and restrictive. A similar transformation occurred in Turkey during the 1950s. Model houses, furniture, appliances, and household goods introduced a new vision of domestic comfort. These influences quickly entered Turkish apartment interiors, where American brand names and electrical devices became desirable markers of modern life. Architectural publications mirrored this shift. Refrigerators, washing machines, pressure cookers, and water heaters frequently appeared in advertisements and were shown directly in furnishing plans. Kitchens and bathrooms, fully occupied with modern appliances, were increasingly presented as symbols of progress. Turkish architectural discourse also emphasized the rationalization of domestic work. By the late 1960s, scholars argued that mechanization, sequencing, and organization of housework were central to designing modern housing. In her dissertation, dating to late 1960s, Nigan Beyazıt emphasized the role of mechanization and organization of domestic work in the rationalization of housing. Bathrooms, on the other hand, became especially emblematic of this change, as widely advertised American water heaters and thermosiphones gradually replaced traditional wood-heated systems, while the Western-style bathroom gained cultural dominance over the Turkish hammam and Alaturka lavatory. Literary narratives of the period echoed these developments. Many novels described homes filled with modern appliances as spaces that eased women's labor and represented a desirable aspirational ideal. As an example for that, again, Refik Halit Karay's novel captures how young women imagined modern appliances as symbols of freedom from exhausting domestic labor by saying, when I get married, I will live in a house more or less like this, she thought. I will be the mistress of such a house, and I'll be free from heating and washing water in a gas can, from lighting and cleaning the coal stove, from washing clothes by hand. Or Orhan Kemal likewise portrays technological comfort as a promise of care, mobility in his novel Devlet Kuşu, The Bird of Fortune, and says, see me then, mom, you won't wear what you have worn once, you won't go from hot to cold. I will buy you a washing machine, an electric iron, a pressure cooker, a refrigerator, and go on. Yet the novels also reveal the ambivalence hidden beneath this technological enthusiasm. Several characters question whether modern devices truly improved life, expressing discomfort and even alienation. For example, as we can see, Peride Celal shows a deep discomfort within the idea that machines could replace embodied domestic labor in her novel Gecenin Ucunda, At the Edge of the Night, and says, even if he had millions and bought dimensions, he still wouldn't want a refrigerator or a washing machine. God had given man hands, arms, inexhaustible power. And if you don't wash the laundry by hand, if you didn't lay the tablecloth on the floor and eat the way you were accustomed to by your ancestors. And in another example, Orhan Kemal offers a critique of apartment life and the perceived artificiality introduced by appliances in his novel Kötü Yol, The Wrong Road, and says, each one has a few washing machines. They wash their dirty clothes in the machine in one breath. They wash it, but can it be like laundry washed in a basin by human hands? So these accounts reveal a tension largely absent from architectural publications. While magazines presented new appliances as clear symbols of progress, the novels show that users often met them with hesitation, discomfort, and even resistance. Instead of seamlessly improving daily life, technological change sometimes disrupted established habits and produced feelings of alienation within the home. As technology reshaped the material environment, it also transformed lived experience and gendered expectations. Mid-century novels portrayed also women in multiple roles within the home, as organizers of daily routines, enforcers of household order, or characters who actively challenged these expectations. Written largely by male authors, these narratives often outline what women were presumed to do in the domestic sphere, creating a recurring fictional template for how home should function. At the same time, women appear as key figures through whom broader lifestyle changes become visible, whether through their activities inside the home or through markers of modernity such as clothing, grooming, or consumption practices. Interdisciplinary research shows that the modern home in Europe and in the United States developed alongside changing social values, class structures, and everyday practices, with women's domestic roles central to the formation of middle-class ideals of home and family. My presentation extends these discussions to the mid-20th century Turkey, where architectural discourse, state reforms, media, and daily life collectively shaped domestic modernity. The 19th century separation of home and work, as we already know, had cast the house as a feminine moral domain, a view that persisted after World War II as suburban comfort and consumer culture became symbols of stability. Events like the kitchen debates reinforced this gender divide, and in Turkey, similar ideals circulated through early Republican reforms, girls' institutes, architectural education, and women's magazines, which portrayed housekeeping as scientific, nationally valuable, and central to the ideal modern Turkish woman. Yet Turkish women were also becoming increasingly visible in public and professional life, producing a tension between domestic expectations and broader social ambitions. Figures like Übeyde Elli embodied this duality. She entered politics with her father's support and held various positions in the Republican Party's district and provincial administrations until she became the head of the Central Committee of the party's women's branches. When it was featured by the weekly news magazine Akis, she presented together with the pictures of a kitchen and the parliament, and it was emphasized that she did not neglect her home despite her active political life. The magazine highlighted both her political career and motherhood, as well as informing her dressing preferences, her practical meals, and appetite for sewing. And altogether, these dynamics reveal that the mid-century home in Turkey as a negotiated space where gender roles, national identity, and modern aspirations were continuously shaped and challenged. These tensions surfaces clearly in the novels of the periods, which reveal two dominant stances toward home and homemaking. In the first, women are depicted as content, even fulfilled, by their domestic roles. They're presented with managing routines, creating order, and taking pride in the comforts and aesthetics of the home. Kitchens were often symbolizing both women's authority and their responsibility, while describing the kitchen as a laboratory. Cahit Uçuk, for example, shows in her novel Küçük Ev, The Little House, that the work conducted in the kitchen belongs to women as an indisputable reality, and says, Mualla said about kitchens, laboratories of life and health, she used to say. The two friends believed that cooking was one of the greatest arts of women. Or in Kayıp Aranıyor, Missing Person by Sait Faik Abısyanık presents a voice that links a young woman's happiness to traditional domestic skills and says it is customary for young girls to adapt to the manners and ways of the family they enter. But does our daughter know how to repair? Can she wash dishes? Can she change diapers? If she does all these things, maybe she will taste happiness. The novel also exemplifies the second stance, the narratives highlighted regarding the domestic status of women. According to this, women feature as figures who develop mixed feelings by being happy at home. The female character who has taken full responsibility of her home and who ties belonging and happiness to the comfort at home begins after a while to remember her real self and express dissatisfaction with her existence in life. Characters such as Nur articulate this ambivalence vividly. The home provides security and identity, but also restricts mobility, autonomy, and participation in public life. It says, now it's my husband who rules my world, his cooking, ironing, laundry. The work of the house is endless. As one ends, another begins. In the past, it was me who was important, by my class, my duty, the time of my meal. But now, Ferit and I have switched roles. The important thing is him and his work. I can't get away, I can't walk the streets as I please. In Suçumuz İnsan Olmak, Our Crime is Being Human, Oktay Akbal uses a single kitchen scene to evoke the idealized image of a young woman through domestic objects and atmosphere and says, immediately one imagines the woman who will wear it, who will cook, fry eggplant and meatballs by the gas stove. This woman cannot be old, she cannot be ugly, she cannot be devoid of feelings of beauty and goodness. In this green apron, there can only be a young blonde. Similar voices of challenges and dilemmas that the women raised for the modern apartment life in the Turkish novels concerning women's association to homemaking were raised in the US context as well, where suburban modernity promised comfort but often produced isolation. These emotional nuances seldom appear in architectural publications of the time, which largely celebrated technological progress and efficient layouts. Critical discussions of women's lived experience inside modern housing emerged much later, notably in the 1980s, when architects began questioning how housing contributed to gender inequalities. In the 1983 issue of the magazine Mimarlık, it is emphasized that the problem of housing should be reconstructed, this time with women at the center, by saying, the housing problem is not the provision of housing, but the life in the housing. It is not the lack of housing, but the social infertility and anxiety caused by existing housing. The duties of housewifery and motherhood either cut women off from social life and productivity or turn them into second-class workers who are discriminated against. Beyond all the problems that women share with men, housing is also a problem for women as one of the areas of the division of labor based on distinction even between men and women. Read alongside this discourse, the novels show that mid-20th century domestic roles for women diverged sharply from the early Republican ideal of the publicly active professional. They also reveal that domestic interiors were not mere American imports, but spaces women actively shaped, using modern comforts to negotiate identity within traditional gender norms. Beyond homemaking, women appeared as visible carriers of modernity through their bodies, clothing, and practices of self-presentation. In my next subsection, therefore, I examine fashion, beauty, and material culture as extensions of domestic and modernity. After the Second World War, the US became a major cultural reference for Turkey, and particularly in fashion, consumer goods, and domestic technology. A defining moment was the 1957 Izmir International Fair, where a full-scale American model house introduced visitors to modern appliances, synthetic fabrics and plastics, and new household items. This display made the link between home, consumption, and modern living vividly visible. Fashion strongly shaped these perceptions. Post-war styles, especially those featuring nylon, darkroom, or other synthetics, circulated widely through magazines and advertisements. They projected a modern, confident female figure whose clothing echoed the clean, efficient interiors of the model home. Thus, fashion, femininity, and domestic space became symbolically intertwined as vehicles through which modernity reached the Turkish middle class. Plastic and synthetic materials similarly transformed domestic interiors. Products such as formica, melamine, vinyl flooring, and Polyethylene containers promised hygiene, brightness, and labor-saving convenience. These materials were promoted as tools that would help women manage domestic labor more efficiently, aligning household technology with broader aspirations for order and comfort. Architectural journals reinforce these messages by presenting plastics as adaptable, durable, and aesthetically suited to the modern home. Women were cast as central agents of this transformation. They were through the fashions they wore and the goods they selected for their homes. Mid-century Turkey thus saw the home emerge as a site where gender, consumption, and modernization converged, and where American influence mixed with local expectations. These dynamics also appear in narratives of the period. The three recurring scenes illustrate how female characters were represented through adornment, fashion, and domestic responsibility. First, scenes of adornment highlight mostly synthetic new consumer items that promise attractiveness, style, and practicality. As Orhan Kemal illustrates in his novel Gurbet Kuşları, Birds of Exile, adornment scenes often foreground synthetic fabrics that signaled modern attractiveness and practicality, and says she looked wonderful in her elegant pink petticoat, whether it was nylon, rayon, or orlon, brought from the United States by I don't know which inspection committee. Similarly, Peride Celal highlights in her novel Gecenin Ucunda, At the Edge of the Night, how domestic interiors filled with modern materials shaped the portrayal of women's roles and spaces, and says, I leave my mother alone in her tidy, ornate, beautiful living room, at her table, in her kitchen decorated with nylon curtains and drapes, where new pewter pots shine. The second scene presented women as modern and fashionable, an image matching the technologically and fashionably adorned interiors. A woman's choice of clothes, jewelry, cosmetics, or self-care were articulated as an assessment of the modern domestic interior. In her novel Sabah Yıldızı, Morning Star, Muazzez Tahsin Berkant portrays the clothing and accessories that would make a woman look stylish and elegant as follows. When I returned to the hotel in the evening, my room was full of packages that had arrived since the morning. I now had several dresses and silk linen, leather gloves, cobweb thin stockings, high-scaled scarves, in short, everything that makes a woman look stylish and elegant. Or Mükerrem Kamil Su reveals in her novel Gençliğimin Rüzgarı, The Wind of My Mouth, how women navigated social scrutiny using clothing to align with the expectations of their new urban surroundings, and says, in her new life, first and foremost, she had to solve the issue of clothing. She looked for ostentation in the neighborhood she changed to. Now she had friends who looked at a person from head to toe and gave her a grade in minutes. Architectural publications of the period echoed this ideal by pairing new domestic products such as blinds, automatic curtains, and other household technologies with images of well-dressed women enjoying the modern comfort. And third, the novels reveal attention often absent from promotional discourse. Although consumer goods and modern fashion promised self-care and personal freedom, domestic responsibilities frequently prevented women from achieving these ideals. In Orhan Kemal's novel Bir Filiz Vardı, There Was Once a Sapling, likewise, Filiz was portrayed as a woman of modern appearance who assumed this identity not by running domestic daily routines, but being non-domestic and working, and says elegant, graceful, swaggering civil servant ladies with lipstick on their lips and stylish clothes passed through her head. Was Filiz going to be one of them? Why not? In Peride Celal's novel Gecenin Ucunda, again, the character did makeup and dressed to go out of the home, and she says every morning Nadia would wear starch white blouses. She would put on jewelry and go out into the street to work fresh and happy. So in mid-century novels thus depict the modern woman as both a well-dressed, groomed, socially active figure and a central organizer of household life. Architecture likewise imagined domestic technology as enabling women to save time and devote more attention to themselves. But literature of the period reveals that this promise often remained unfulfilled. Despite the proliferation of modern goods, the pressures of domestic life continued to limit women's ability to embody the self-care ideals promoted by advertising and design culture. If adornment marked women's negotiations of modernity within the home, public space offered another arena where these negotiations unfolded. In mid-century apartment culture, women in Turkey, much like their American counterparts, were closely tied to domestic space. According to the American post-war ideal of the suburban housewife, this figure is celebrated as the guardian of comfort and efficiency and reinforced by an advertising industry that linked technological progress to domestic life. A similar technological shift unfolded in Turkey, where modern appliances promised to ease domestic labor and give women greater control over household life. Yet this promise sat uneasily beside the early Republican ideal of the educated, civically active women of the 1920s and 1930s, who was also expected to maintain a hygienic modern home. Beauty, youth, hygiene, and civic engagement were all tied to visions of national progress, but women were framed less autonomous individuals than as symbolic agents of modernization. This dual expectation generated an enduring tension between women's public identity and their domestic role, one that continued in the post-war era. By the mid-20th century, as the nuclear family became the norm, domestic roles hardened. Women's labor was structured around the husband's workday, rendering their contributions largely visible. Literature from the late 1950s and especially the 1960s reflects this shifts. Female characters move away from the efficient housewife stereotype and increasingly express dissatisfaction, exhaustion, and desire for autonomy. These novels reveal how women internalized and negotiated the pressures of domestic modernity and how the home functioned as both a space of comfort and a site of constraint. While female authors articulated these tensions more explicitly, several male novelists also raised questions about women's position within domestic and family life. They often use critical or patronizing language to challenge the ideal of the housewife and the notion of marriage as a woman's ultimate aspiration. Characters rebel against expectations of obedience, criticize the inequities built into domestic roles, and resist being confined to household duties. In the first, women's status in both domestic and family life was questioned. To do this, authors used a patronizing language to criticize both being a housewife and the aspiration to marry and become a lady of the house. They questioned the previous generation's absolute obedience to perform the assigned domestic duties. For example, Orhan Kemal highlights in his novel Kötü Yol, The Wrong Road, women's open rejection of the restrictive housewife ideal and the expectations tied to domestic obedience by saying, yes, movie star, I can make you a movie star. Forget about your mom and that brother of yours. They want to make you a simple housewife. I would rather kill myself than be a simple housewife. Or Kerime Azrak underscores in her novel Saadet Tacı, The Crown of Happiness, how social rules rooted in gender inequality shaped women's constrained features and says there was no doubt that the bridesmaids enslaved by those foolish rules based on the inequality between men and women in social life would continue to treat the path of hope as old girls. When they looked back, they would see nothing but the traces of their bad fate. Architectural publications of the period, by contrast, portrayed women almost exclusively within the domestic sphere, codifying their responsibilities and reinforcing their association with homemaking. In the second way of addressing women's status in fiction, the writers use modern public spaces of Istanbul. The Istanbul Hilton and later the Divan Hotel served as symbolic in-between spaces where women stepped outside domestic obligations to socialize, host gatherings, or simply enjoy the spectacle of modern public life. Tea martinis, fashion competition, encounters with foreign tourists, and elegant ceremonies staged in hotel interiors depicted women testing the boundaries of public visibility. Other scenes show women wandering the city, visiting museums, attending theater performances, or simply observing urban crowds enabled them to explore individuality and freedom. Muazzez Berkan in her novel Sabah Yıldızı, A Morning Star Against, depicts women exploring the city alone, using public life to cultivate independence and pleasure by saying, as a result, I gradually start to wander around, even going to Tokatlian or the Park Hotel for the tea with some new friends I had found. Or Halide Edip Adıvar shows in her novel Akile Hanım Street, how modern hotels become social hubs where women hosted gatherings and accessed cosmopolitan environments, and says, to tell you the truth, I'm very comfortable since I started having my reception days at the Divan Hotel. My friends are also pleased. The female characters who spend time outside the home and in the public life were mostly portrayed as enjoying the public pleasures alone. Portraits of self-sufficient and free women were narrated in the acts of discovering their individuality, getting amazed and feeling pleasure from observing the expanding and crowded cities. These narratives also reveal how American popular culture entered public life. Rock and roll, translated in Turkish as sallan yuvarlan, appears frequently as a symbol of modern sociability and youthful energy. Women dance, listen to records, and participate in new forms of entertainment, sometimes with excitement, sometimes with hesitation about appearing alone in public or adopting foreign behaviors. In Muazzez Berkant's novel, she captures that the tension women felt when navigating public spaces alone, balancing excitement with social anxiety, and says, after placing the little orange ticket in my bag, I ran out in the street. I was strangely excited. But what am I going to do now? How can I sit in a box by myself, a woman alone? Is this unheard of? Or Adıvar comments in her novel on the Americanization of urban leisure, highlighting women's growing participation in new forms of dance and sociability, and says, our women are so Americanized now, he said. Dick laughed. On the one hand, yes, they're especially good at our dances. One day recently, I danced swing and roll with Mrs. Nermin in Emirgan. Unlike the literature of the period, the image of women who liberated herself from domestic duties and who positioned herself in public life as a free individual will become visible only in the architectural publications of the 1980s. As Arhan Acar criticizing in this article by saying, if we realize that the current forms of housing tend to encourage women's detachment from urban space and social life, if we see housing not only as a problem of resources and cities, but also as an important problem of women's way of life, I believe we'll be closer to solutions that will be radical and lasting for all of us. So broadly speaking, the novels of the mid-century question the dominant prototypes of the ideal home and the ideal housewife, a critique that found little resonance in contemporary architectural discourse. Yet even as women ventured into public space, the emotional meaning of home itself was undergoing profound transformation. Literature reveals a growing discomfort with domestic expectations, prompting new reflections on what it means to dwell. So, in the next section here, I will try to explore this emotional and psychological redefinition of the home. In mid-century Turkish literature often portrayed the home as a place of protection and moral order, yet this image gradually eroded as characters began to feel confined by domestic routines and expectations. The house, once a symbol of stability, appeared increasingly restrictive, reflecting a broader search for individuality and the desire to shape life beyond traditional roles. Architectural discourse of the same period raised parallel questions about what it meant to dwell. Modern, efficient, technologically occupied houses did not automatically create a sense of belonging. With the rise of appliances and mechanical comfort, domestic space became more standardized and detached from locality and memory, producing what some thinkers described as a rootless modern home. At the same time, emotional ties to a familiar home place were recognized as fundamental yet difficult to sustain within this new domestic order. In the novels, a living home, rather than inhabiting it, often emerged as a gesture of liberation, revealing the deep ambivalence surrounding domestic modernity. Feride Celal illustrates in her novel Güz Şarkısı, Autumn Song, how the home, once protective, becomes a surface of suffocation that characters long to escape, and says, they finally got what they wanted. I'm leaving Istanbul. I'm leaving you guys. Actually, she should have been happy. I was fed up with that house. Grandma Sakinah's nagging, the girl, the boy. I was fed up with them all. Celal further reveals how traditional expectations and family obligations transform the home into a restrictive emotional enclosure by saying, I was a thing of the horrible four walls they called the family heart. of traditions, of the responsibilities imposed by being wealthy and well-bred, of the law, of the eyes of those who surrounded me with love. According to the authors, modern apartment life was reduced to a monotonous repetition of tasks that shaped daily existence. Residents longed for a sense of freedom and sought relief from these routines, arguing that such change could only begin by questioning the assumptions, habits, and rules that refined space called home. Oktay Akbal depicts in his novel Suçumuz İnsan Olmak the monotony of apartment life and the quiet longing for freedom that domestic routines produce by saying, he was desperate to go home, the house that smelled of damp and kitchen. On the way, he kept thinking about his duty to his wife, his duty to his children. And also he uses moments of critique within the home to question rigid habits and call for a more dynamic way of living and says, these armchairs are not for standing still, but for sitting. These curbs are not for waiting like flat, glossy pictures, but for stepping on. This house and your mindset must change, Mom. While the literature of the period was fundamentally problematizing the image and concept of the home as being a refugee, the architectural publications continued to focus on topics like making everyone a homeowner as the most important achievement. Sayar also criticized the failure of housing policies to meet the needs of low-income residents, linking this gap to the rise of unhealthy urban settlements. By the early 1970s, this technocratic view of housing began to be challenged from within architectural discourse itself. Abdullah Quran argued that the prevailing model, rooted in seeing the house as a machine for living, had reached its limits. For him, the urgent task was no longer further mechanization, but humanizing an environment increasingly shaped by technology. These concerns would resonate even more strongly in later literary discussions. In Ev Ödevi, homework, Nurdan Gürbilek described the moment when home chooses to be home not simply as a loss of innocence, but as the realization that the house is both a refugee and an obstacle. It provides an inner world, yet also generates inner turmoil. It promises protection, yet reveals its own fragility. The intensity of this experience varies from person to person, but it remains the first stage where our lifelong images of happiness, fear, and anxiety take shape. So these literary and architectural perspectives together expose a deeply ambivalent domestic modernity, one that promised comfort and progress while generating tension, alienation, and desire to escape. This study at the end has demonstrated that the mid-century Turkish home was not a passive architectural container, but a deeply contested cultural arena in which modernity was materially built, emotionally negotiated, and continuously reimagined. By reading architectural publications alongside a wide corpus of novels, the research reveals that domestic modernization in Turkey unfolded simultaneously across three intertwined layers: the material reorganization of the home through American-inspired commodities and technologies, the gendered scripts of homemaking that position women both as agents and subjects of modern domestic order, and the lived tensions, aspirations, and ambivalences articulated through literary narrative. Whereas architectural discourse typically redefined housing as a technical, economic, or planning problem, literature illuminated how these spaces were actually perceived, inhabited, and resisted, showing domesticity as a site where progress, desire, and discomfort coexisted. As across mid-century Turkey, architectural publications and literary narratives shared several points of convergence. Both mediums increasingly drew on American cultural differences, reflecting the broader post-war orientation toward US models of modern living. They also address shifting consumption habits, portraying domestic technology as central to redefining everyday life. Within this shared framework, women appeared as key figures. Both architects and novelists depicted them as primary consumers of the home, responsible for organizing and maintaining its order, and as central agents in the visual and material modernization of the domestic interior. Yet these points of overlap were accompanied by notable tensions that became especially visible in the literary resources. While architectural discourse often celebrated technological progress as a path to comfort and liberation, the novels consistently revealed that domestic appliances did not eliminate the burden of housework nor provide freedom promised in modernist rhetoric. Likewise, the technological embellishment of the home that journals enthusiastically promoted rarely appeared with the same intensity in fictional apartment interiors, where everyday life remained shaped by repetition and constraint. Literature also illuminated gender experiences that architectural writing largely overlooked. Female characters struggle to maintain a polished, well-groomed image not only inside the home, but in the world beyond it, navigating a growing desire to spend time in public venues that offered forms of sociability and visibility absent from domestic life. Such moments of self-fashioning and public presence surfaced repeatedly in novels, but were mostly entirely missing from architectural discourse. Finally, characters often expressed the belief that personal autonomy and individuality could be achieved only by stepping outside the home, to which they were also intimately bound. This ambivalence between longing and suffocation, comfort and confinement, reveals a deeper rift between the idealized modern home celebrated in architectural narratives and the lived realities rendered in literature. Ultimately, the analysis shows that mid-century domestic modernity in Turkey was fundamentally ambivalent. It was shaped by the global Cold War imaginary, yet grounded in local practices. It promised ease and progress, yet introduced new constraints. It relied on gender ideals, yet enabled subtle forms of resistance and negotiation. By foregrounding women's experiences, literary depictions of dwelling complicate the dominant architectural narrative, revealing how the modern home could simultaneously function as a site of aspiration, discipline, comfort, and emotional rupture. These layered and sometimes contradictory meanings demonstrate that the home was not merely modernized, it became a critical threshold where the social, cultural, and psychological dimensions of Turkish modernity were continuously remade. Thank you for listening.